Hey guys, today on the BodCast, I'm talking with a good friend and performing strongman, David Whitley. David and I are talking about his new project called the Advancing Man Project and what it means to be an advancing man. This is just a good conversation between two friends talking about being a dad and the challenges that come with being a dad and trying to do our best to set a good example for our children. I really think you'll enjoy some of the wisdom that David drops in his conversation, and if nothing else, you'll get to eavesdrop on two good friends. All right, guys, thanks so much for listening to the Original Strength podcast. Pull up a chair and buckle up. It's the Original Strength podcast. Dave, the Iron Tamer Whitley. What's up,
I am
man?
here. Hey, how's it going? Good to be here today.
Thanks for coming. I appreciate you being on the show.
I am happy to be here. Always enjoy talking to you, my friend.
And you. So, my first question for you is, have you tamed any iron lately?
I was bending some 60 penny nails yesterday. So yes, I have.
Right on. Have you got any shows coming up?
I've got a friend of mine has a martial arts school, and every year he celebrates the birthday of the school. So his 17th year in business is coming up on, I think, the 20th of this month. And I always go and do a few feats for that, just for the celebration. But I don't have any like on stage, get on an airplane, big shows like I've done in the past before.
Okay.
Currently,
Are you still being superhuman on a regular basis for yourself?
the best I can, yes, every day, striving for that.
So speaking of superhuman, awesome book, by the way.
Thank you.
I love that because you helping people remove limits, take limits off of themselves. Do you have any other books in the wings coming up?
Books. I have an idea for a book, but it's based off the current coaching program project that I've been working on called the Advancing Man Project. And that is geared specifically for fathers who want to break and replace generational cycles of limited thinking, conflicting beliefs, that sort of stuff that they inherited from their upbringing, so that they don't pass those things on to their children.
That sounds pretty strong, brother. The Advancing Man Project.
That's correct.
What's your definition of the advancing man?
Well, I got the name from Wallace Wattles and the book that he wrote back in the early 1900s, I think 1910, The Science of Getting Rich. And he emphasizes in there the idea of an advancing man, which is someone who's always striving to improve themselves and to move forward in life. And when I decided to start doing personal development stuff in the wake of being a performing strongman, and the mental aspects of performing strongman stuff, mental rehearsal, visualization, confidence, all of that, taking those ideas and applying it to a personal development type of situation for myself and for other people, it worked really, really well. And then when my wife and I found out that she was pregnant with our son, and I started to really realize the importance of being the role model dad for my son. That was really when the idea of the Advancing Man Project came about, because in that book, Wallace Wattles talks about something called the law of increase, or the impression of increase. And essentially that is, in the context he writes the book, it is giving a customer more in use value than you receive from them in cash value or in money value. That's a really great way to do business, right? It's a win-win for everybody. And so I started playing with that idea, and I thought, what if the guiding principle that I have in everything that I do with my son is find a way in every single interaction that I have with him to leave him better off than he was before the interaction. And that can be something that's very fun and very exciting, like helping him figure out how to do a specific skill. He's playing t-ball now, so like helping him figure out how to do the skills related to that. Or it can be, one of the other things that he recently has started doing is figuring out how to navigate the screen on an iPhone, right? I mean, that's a skill. And I don't just hand him the phone and let him watch videos to be the babysitter for him, but like if he's wanting to figure something out, um, I'll show him, push this tap here and do this kind of thing so that we can get, say, the TV show that he wants to watch to cast from the phone to the television, right? So it's an educational type process like that. But then also, it's not necessarily a pleasant thing, right? Back in December was my dad's birthday, and he passed away in 2020. And on his birthday, I was feeling pretty rough, just kind of dealing with that. And my son comes up to me, he looks at me, and he says, "Why does your face look like that?" He's 4.5. And I said, "Well, I'm feeling, what does my face look like?" And he says, "Well, you look sad." I said, "Okay, well, I am feeling kind of sad. Why are you sad?" And so I explained it to him. And, that by the time I'm done telling him that my daddy's gone, I'm not going to be able to be around him anymore, that I miss him because I love him, and that, I'm sad about that. I'm also sad that my daddy doesn't get to see him as he's growing up. And so there's all these emotions to go along with that. And I did I spoke to him in such a way that it was appropriate for a 4-year-old to understand. But, I also didn't like just sweep it under the rug. Right. And so by the time I'm done, I've got tears rolling down my face, and he kind of looks at me and says, "Oh, okay." And he goes on about his business. And one of the things that I've always promised myself that I would do is I would be as honest about things as I possibly can in an appropriate way for him as a child. And so it would be very easy in a situation like that, and very, I think, socially acceptable, or for lack of a better term, normal, to be able to say, "Well, I'm fine, nothing's wrong, don't worry about it," whatever, and just not show that side of what I was going through to him because he's 4. But I realized after the fact that what I did is I successfully, I believe, modeled what it looks like to express grief in an appropriate way over the loss of a loved one as a grown man, because so much of what is just inherent in society, things like boys don't cry, right? Be a tough guy, stop crying like a little girl, that kind of stuff, which, there's just a whole bunch of things that I don't want to pass on to unpack from that kind of thing. And then, of course, the flip side of that is like the little girl who's on the playground, and the little boy comes up and pushes her, pulls her hair, and is being mean to her, and she goes and tells the adult, which is what she should do. And the response to that is, "Well, he's doing that because he likes you." Well, how does that affect a person? If you trace the trajectory of that, what if that is at the root of why, 30 years later, there she is in a domestic violence situation with yet another abusive partner, 3 or 4 kids from 3 or 4 different partners who are continually being exposed to that kind of energy, because she was taught as a very young child that if someone really likes you, they'll be mean to you. And so the meaner they are to you, the more they like you, is kind of the logical conclusion to that, right? And she's never explained, or never had it explained to her, well, if someone doesn't like you, are they nice to you? Right. I mean, so there's like this cognitive dissonance that goes along with that. And like same thing with the boys don't cry kind of thing, right? If you drill that into a kid's head enough, fast forward several decades, and here you have this completely emotionally unavailable man who's not there for his wife. He's not there for his kids. He doesn't know how to express what's going on with himself because he's been taught from such an early age that it's not okay for you to express these negative emotions out loud. And then as movement professionals, we know what happens to that. It gets lodged in the body, right? It gets trapped almost like at a cellular level. And, here we are, 2 or 3 decades pass by, and people are wondering why they're messed up. It's because they inherited these broken beliefs, these conflicting ideas that they internalized into their own belief systems without ever questioning it, right? And so my idea of how to navigate life as an advancing man is to fully express who I am the best way that I can, and allow myself to be the role model for the kid. I kind of feel like I went all over the place with that, but you asked what it means to me, and I'm just sort of a stream of consciousness telling you right now.
Right. So,
Right?
so in becoming an advancing man, it sounds like um, you're kind of trying to, I want to say, simplify it too much and say become a better human, but you're actually trying to develop yourself so that with your own interactions with your child, you're trying to help them grow to be a very balanced and healthy, emotionally strong-minded, resilient person. That
Absolutely.
okay.
Absolutely. There's an element of balance, but there's also an element of harmony there, right? There's balanced and harmonious don't necessarily mean the same thing. They're interrelated, but they don't necessarily mean exactly the same thing, right? Like balance would typically refer to an even distribution or an equilibrium between elements. You know,
Mhm.
obviously, if we're talking about physical movement, it's not falling down or that kind of stuff. But in a an emotional sense or in a habitual sense, you know, you get a balance between your work and your leisure. You get a balance between family and work, or you know, that sort of stuff. And the idea there sort of implies that no one aspect dominates or takes up too much time or resources, and that's great. But I think that the the element of harmony, being harmonious, belongs in there because and it helps it all work together, right? Harmony is like it's a pleasing combination of elements that work well together. Like in music, if a single string on a guitar is out of tune, you're not making good harmony. If you have a choir and one person doesn't sing or sings the wrong note, or a band and someone plays a wrong note, it disrupts the harmony. And so harmony can be a very dynamic thing. Balance has to be a very dynamic thing as well. And so those two things interplay together. And to become this advancing man is to embrace that and understand that. You referenced my shirt earlier. You know, you got all these. I got all these superheroes on here, and almost all of them have alter egos, right? And so having that harmony and having that balance is like knowing when to show up as Peter Parker to take your physics test and knowing when to show up as Spider-Man to fight Thanos, right? Peter Parker doesn't show up on the battlefield. Spider-Man doesn't show up in chemistry class. So it's being able to assume these different alter egos is what I call them. They're like different aspects of a personality that we express, right? And so when I'm in dad mode, I'm completely different than I am when I'm on stage bending steel mode, but it's still me. And so being able to have that harmonious relationship brings about the balance, and continually seeking advancement. And we've talked before about our mutual influence, John Brookfield, and how he talks about you should always be progressive, you should always be moving forward, we should always be striving to get better, even if we're not. And I just took that idea and applied it to parenting. I apply it to everything else as best I can too, but with the Advancing Man Project coaching element that I'm doing right now, it's geared specifically towards dads who are becoming aware, like they probably have their business and financial life together pretty well, right? Either they're entrepreneurial or they're doing well with that. They understand that, possibly have hired a coach to help them with their business. They have their health and fitness figured out. They know what to do. They're doing well with that. They probably hired a coach to help with that. But when it comes to their children, they aren't sure what to do, right? And so they find themselves very often having some sort of interaction with their child, and they'll say something or do something in the midst of an emotionally heightened situation where the kid's not doing what they want them to do, or you know, they're doing something that is developmentally appropriate but not necessarily fun for an adult to be a part of, right?
Right.
Upset, crying, angry, whatever, you know.
Tantrum in the middle of Walmart.
Yeah and so when that's going on, it triggers the response of what we learned when we were kids, right? Which goes back to the boys don't cry and all of that stuff, right? So several of the guys that I've worked with have said that one of the reasons they were drawn to doing the work that we're doing is that something happened with their kid and they heard things come out of their mouth that was like the worst memories that they had from their childhood, the thing they hated the most about the way their mother or father talked to them. And there they are doing it, the thing they swore they would never do. And yet they're doing it because that is part of their programming. Right. I'm like, and they don't want to do that. And they do it it's almost like they're being controlled by someone else. And I'm like, well, you are being controlled by someone else. You're being controlled by this programming that was put into you before you even were aware of it, and you didn't consent to it, right? It was put there by someone who was doing the best that they could do with what they had at the time, didn't know any more about what they were doing than you do now, maybe even less. And they were just doing the best they could, but they were doing what was handed to them. And so it's like, that's why we call it generational cycles, right? And so we have these diametrically opposed belief systems that we tend to say that we want to live by. Like, we'll tell a kid that we value honesty and it's not okay to lie. But then you go to a restaurant and kids under 12 eat free, and the kid's 12. We're going to tell everybody you're 11, but don't say anything, right? So that seems very minor, but it sets up a dissonance within our own mind that just can wreak havoc on the way that we're able to interact with stuff, because then we don't have a code that we live by. We're not conscious about it, right? And so in doing all this work for myself, the way it came about, honestly, is when we had a hard time, my wife and I, when we decided that we wanted to have children, or have our son. We're only going to have the one because of some of this stuff. We had a very difficult time getting him here. And then once we found out that she was pregnant, and once we found out that this was actually a thing that was going to happen, I was like, okay, great, this is awesome. And then it was immediately just struck by the enormity of it. And I'm like, how do I want this kid to come up? What do I want to be for this kid? How do I want to show up for him? What values do I want to instill in him? And so I thought, like everything else that I've done in any sort of mindset work, is figure out where I am and where I want to be. I'm going to sit down and start writing out what the target is, right? And so I wrote down on a piece of paper all these different things. And then I stopped and looked at that piece of paper, and I'm like, there are so many things on this list that I am falling so short of what I could be doing. I've got to get to work on myself, because we know that do as I say, not as I do, does not, has not, and never will work. At best, it will suppress something. It will not teach anything. It will suppress something that's already in there and like create resentment. It'll make them better at being sneaky, right? And I didn't want that kind of relationship with my son. So I set about getting to work on those things for myself. And in the course of doing that, along with all the other personal development work and study that I've done with people like Wallace Wattles, Napoleon Hill, and Bob Proctor, Joe Vitale, all that sort of stuff, understanding how the subconscious mind works and how that's where that programming comes from, right? That's where the feeling like someone else is in control of me comes from, because it's that was programmed in there by people, like I said earlier, before I had a say in the matter. And so I came to realize a very important thing, that tradition is peer pressure from dead people. And just because we've always done it this way doesn't mean that it's a good way to do it. Something that was done a particular way a few decades ago might have worked great then, but surely we've evolved by now, right? To be able to do things better in most cases there, right? And so I started looking at it, and I'm like, I realized that it all comes down to what I call an internal code. And there are 3 components to this internal code. And I'm a big fan of getting very clear on terms and definitions when I start doing this sort of thing, right? There's the wonderful quote from Tony Blauer.
Balance and harmony. You set me straight, right? Like, so, and I like that you get into what the words really mean. So that's awesome.
Well, and a side note on that, right? Like when we take a group of letters and form it into a word, that's called what?
A word.
Spelling.
Okay.
We spell words, right?
We spell words.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Right. And so if we look at like casting an enchantment on someone, that is a spell. And so there's magic in our words, right? And I believe that all of that works because of the way the mind works. So our words have that power, right? I mean, our words are magic in a very real, literal sense, because it creates our reality, right? The way that we speak to ourselves. And so when I was looking at this thing and narrowing things down to this internal code, I realized that there were 3 different components to it. And I wanted to get very clear on I came to that by getting clear on what the definitions of these words internal code meant. Internal obviously means inside. right? That's where we're going with that. It's coming from within. Code, however, has multiple different definitions, and lots of words in our English language do that. The three definitions that spoke to me most that applied to this were the literal Latin root word of code is codex, and that literally means book of laws. So my internal code contains my book of laws, which is the code of conduct that I've set for myself. It's how I conduct myself. It's what I say that I value, and how I'm going to interact with other people and the things that I'm going to do, right? It is the laws by which I live as a person. The second definition that I have, and these are no particular order either, is a secret language, right? If you and I, as people who've lifted kettlebells before, start talking about snatch, just the word snatch, that means something to us that it might not mean to someone who's, say, an Olympic lifter. Similar, but different. And if it's someone who has no idea about either one of those training disciplines, snatching something is to go grab it and run away with it, right? It means something completely different. So in a very real sense, we're talking in code to each other, and it's a language that we both understand when we talk about snatches. And we could do that with anything, like we could talk about rolling and rocking, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rock and roll is music. Rock and roll is also part of our resets when we do original strength stuff. So there's that aspect of it. But what I really wanted to dial in on that is the secret language and how I have these internal dialogues within myself, how I'm speaking to myself about myself. Because the question I like to ask guys is, if you knew someone who spoke to you about you the same way that you speak to yourself about yourself, is that person on your side or are they against you? And very often, if we stop and think about it and we just objectively look at the way that we interact with our own self, it's very common for us to make a mistake and say, I'm such an idiot. I don't know why I keep doing this. I don't know what's wrong with me, and just beat ourselves up over something. When the fact is, that's learned, right? You see a little baby who's figuring out how to walk because, that's part of the developmental process. Baby takes a couple steps and falls down. He doesn't beat himself up and look around the room and go, everybody else is able to do this. There must be something wrong with me because I can't do it. And the fact is, he just hasn't developed yet, right?
All right.
And as adults, we don't look at a little child when they fall down and say, what's wrong with you? Everyone else in the room can do this. Why aren't you? I know you're only 9 months old, but why haven't you figured this out yet? There must be something wrong with you. No, we encourage them. And what's actually happening there is a mistake and a course correction, right? Failure is feedback, as we know. And stuff like that. With once a successful rep has been done, success compounds after that, right? The next rep will be even more successful, until the next thing you know, they're running around the house, jumping up and down on the couch, doing whatever it is that they do. And no one had to talk them through that. That's just part of the programming that's inherent in there, right?
Right.
And so if at this point we make a mistake as grown-ups, it's very easy for us to beat ourselves up over it. But we didn't do that as little kids. In a very real sense, it's much like as adults, we've lost our squat. We've lost some of our movement patterns because we've just conditioned it out of ourselves, but it was there. And so I like to think of it as using that internal dialogue to kind of reawaken that understanding of what failure actually is. It's just feedback, right? And that's a small aspect of how the inner conversation stuff works within this secret language component. But the third part of it is the programming itself, right? There's computer code, there's genetic code, and that means that information comes in, it goes through the code, and a result is produced on the other end. And so those three things make up the internal code. The programming part is the part that most of us have the greatest difficulty dealing with, because that's the stuff that was put into us when we were very young that controls our behavior now, and it all works together. Particularly the programming and the secret language. Like if it was programmed into me that that I'm lazy, and I tell myself, well, I guess I'm just lazy, that's why I'm not doing this well, then no matter what I do to change in my book of laws and say, I'm not going to be lazy anymore, I'm still thinking about being lazy, right? So all of these things work together. And the only way to break and replace those generational cycles that we inherited and are largely unaware of is to go in and rewrite this internal code that we have. And the good news is that is entirely possible. I've done it in various aspects of my life. It's not easy. And it's a continual work in progress, just like regaining movement, right? And once you've regained that movement, you have to practice that movement to keep it. So internal code works very much like that we have to go in and reprogram ourselves. And once you understand how to do that, it's not a terribly complicated process. It just takes dedication and it takes consistency.
Showing up
And doing
the work.
Doing the work. Just doing the work.
So for the guy that say somebody's out there and they want to advance, they want to become better, how do they plug in with you and get involved in the project?
Well, with the project itself, I have a workshop coming up on May 17th, I think it is. Yeah, May 17th, where I'm going to do kind of a deep dive into what this entire process looks like. I'm going to tell more of my backstory and how I arrived at this place. I'm going to talk about the actual process. There's a 3-step process that goes along with this. The first step of it is getting clear on where you are and where you want to go. The second step is breaking and replacing all the elements in that internal code that we don't want to be there. And then the final aspect is advancing as a man, which is the continual refinement, the continual perpetual progress that goes along with that. And within that framework, that's how I coach guys through this, right? And so on that workshop, we will go through that part. We'll tell more about the backstory. We'll talk about things that have consistently showed up when I talk to people about this, and they say things like, well, yeah, that sounds good, Dave. And yeah, you can do that. And all these other people can do that, but you don't know my story. You don't know how messed up I am. I don't know if I can do this, right? I believe that it works, but I just don't know that it works for me. And I've seen that in the gym with people before. I've seen that with, original strength stuff. I've seen that all over the place. And really the thing there that we have to do is help people to understand that we all have the same essential innate potential as humans, right? We all have greatness in us. And to a large degree, the aspects of this internal code that we want to break and replace are what is stifling us from being able to express that. When I talk about our superhuman powers, this is where that comes from, right? We have these inherent abilities as people that we can express, super being above and beyond what is normal, right? That's what superhuman is, right? And so in the workshop, I talk about those 3 components. I talk about my backstory a bit. I talk about helping you to understand that, yes, whatever happened to you in the past was bad. We've all been through bad to various different degrees. We've all had things that have upset us, that have derailed us, that have affected us. But the pain of the past can either hold us down, or the pain of the past can be the thing that we use to create our new future by saying, I'm not going back to that. I understand how that affected me. I understand why that happened. Very often I understand that it wasn't my fault that those things happened to me. I can choose to either identify with the person who got messed up by those things, or I can choose to identify with the person who recognized that those things messed me up, and then I fixed it. I took ownership of it. And so on the workshop, we talk quite a bit about how a person can come and look at this process, hear what I have to say about it. And even though they may not believe it themselves, I believe that they can. And I can show them how they can start to develop that belief, because belief and faith are built through tiny little successes, right? And so if we can make one tiny success today, then we are being the advancing man in the same way that I spoke about with my son earlier. If I can leave myself better off after looking at after doing this work, if I can have that tiny success is cumulative, right? The same way that you didn't go to bed lean and wake up fat, you don't go to bed fat and wake up lean. It's cumulative, right? You don't go to bed whole and complete and then wake up with all of these conflicting beliefs and negative thoughts about yourself. there's a cumulative process there. You can take a tiny step today and you may not even notice it, right? It's just like when you go to the gym and you go and you train and you go home, you don't see a result, right? In that hour and a half or whatever. But if you show up and you do the things that you know that have been proven from other people's experiences, even if you've never been through it yourself, if you're new to that, you do that long enough, you'll start to see a little bit of result. And then that fuels you, right? Same thing happens with this reprogramming of the internal code. We do a little bit, we do a little bit, we do a little bit, and then suddenly we turn around and look and we see how far we've come. Something sudden will happen and we will react differently than we used to react. We will respond in a way that was pre-planned, that matches up with our intentional internal code, rather than react and wonder why we did that and feel like we don't have control over it.
Awesome. And so that is May 17th.
Correct.
And where could a person sign up for that if they wanted to?
advancingmanproject.com. You go there and click the button. It put your information in. That puts you on an email list. You get more information about it. You'll have a spot registered and show up for the workshop. And it'll go for about 2.5, 3 hours, something like that. There'll be some time for some Q&A at the end. Yeah, so those are the things that I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk about my backstory. I'm going to talk about the process. I'm going to talk about things that you may believe that are in the way and how those beliefs don't actually stack up, and how if you are determined to better yourself, that you'll be able to. I'm going to show you the way to do that.
Awesome.
And all of this is centered around the idea of how we as fathers are showing up for our kids, right? How we can become that role model, and how we can be the dad that we needed and didn't get, and I talk about my dad a lot. My dad loved me. I had a great relationship with him. There was just some stuff that he brought to the table that didn't serve me, right? And there was aspects of him that negatively impacted me, not through any fault of his own. Like I said, he brought to the table the best what he had, and he did the best he knew how to do with it. Near the end of his life, I had started talking to him about this idea, and two things that he talked to me about, literally on the final conversation that we had. I talk about this in a little more detail in the workshop, but literally the last conversation that I had with him, we spent most of the day together. Everybody knew where he was and what was going on health-wise with him. He was near the end. He knew he didn't have much longer. His body was failing him. And he actually said to me that he was okay with it. He said that everything in this world wears out and this body is worn out. His mind was sharp right up until the very end. And I'm thankful for that, because we were able to have this conversation where we were able to talk about things that we had never talked about, and make sure that, knowing that he was about to check out, his words, that there was nothing left unsaid. And so two of the things that he asked me to promise him, the first one was to make sure that my son Liam knows about him, knows where he came from, knows who he is. And then, of course, absolutely. And then he looks me in the eye and says, and I want you to promise me that you will do a better job with him than I did with you. And I'm like, but you did well. He says, I know I did okay with you. I want you to do better than I did. And so, like, part of the impetus for the Advancing Man Project is this was one of my dad's dying wishes, is for me to, he saw what I had done as far as the mental aspects of Strongman. And then he understood that I could apply that to parenting. And like, it was just a very vague notion 3 years ago when he passed away. And I was talking to him about it, and him saying that made all the pieces start to come together. It took a little while for me to fully realize that that's where it was headed. But I feel like I'm honoring what he said and what he asked me to do and what I promised him that I would do in pursuing this project. And so it's very much a labor of love and a calling, and insert relevant cliche here for me on that, because of that situation.
Dude, that's beautiful. And to use your word, it sounds like you found harmony with all of that. That was
Definitely.
That's strong, man. I don't even know where to go with that, other than I do want to ask you this based on what you just said. For you are a dad now.
I am.
And I know it was really like you were excited to become a dad. Is it as good as you thought it would be?
I had high expectations for how excellent it was going to be.
Okay.
I, I really, really did. And I knew that going into it, I was going to be bombarded with a whole lot of people talking about how much it sucks and how rough it is and how hard it is. And I just refused to allow any of that to seep in. I was just like, next, next, next. And when it actually happened, when he was actually born and he was just, minutes old and I'm holding him, I'm like, oh, this is so much more than I thought it was going to be. Just emotionally, that connection, right? And every single day something happens that makes me a little bit more grateful than I thought I would be. And I know that sounds cliche. I know that sounds trite, but
I get it.
it's the truth. And it's one of those things that until you've experienced it, it's very difficult to articulate, right? But seeing him become who he's becoming and understanding that there was the stuff that I talked about with my dad, his dying wishes, right? But at the other side of that brings balance to and harmony to that is that he shows me every day how to be a better man. When a kid his age does something that is surprisingly kind or surprisingly clever or surprisingly funny, you know, it just I want to be the guy who is able to appreciate that and help him accomplish more of that. And then when it's something that is the opposite of that, when it's something that's not pleasant or it's not kind or it's not funny, I want to be the guy there to help him navigate that experience that he's having. And so in order for me to do that, I have to be fully present, fully in control of who I am. And, we're never fully in control. There's going to be times that we mess up, but when he needs me, I know that I'm going to show up in a certain way because he is driving me to be a better human, to be a better man, to be a better father. Right. And so I know that the example that I set is what is going into his internal code as it's being formed during these early years. And so I don't ever want to make an offhand comment or say something lightly or behave in a certain way that could leave a negative impact on him. So I'm much more aware of those sorts of things in myself. And I'm much less likely to cling to the ego-driven need to be right even when I know that I'm wrong. There's a certain amount of like, well, I know I'm wrong, but I'm going to die on this hill anyway, right?
Yeah,
If I'm
yeah.
wrong, I'm wrong. And it's important for me to, as quickly as I can, recognize a mistake and do what I can to course correct myself now, because I know that that is the thing that I want him to carry into his life. I don't want him to be arrogantly clinging to false information or false beliefs. That's traditionalism, right? That's peer pressure to dead people. And I don't want that for him. I want him to be able to make up his mind about things, and I want him to be able to be a better man than I am. And the better man I can be, if I aspire for him to be a better man, then the better man he's going to be. Does that make sense?
It does. It's beautiful. Like
Thank you.
I often tell people, like, like when they're having a kid, it's like, hey, can't explain it, but there's nothing like it.
Mm-hmm.
But you have
Yeah.
to experience it.
You
But
have to experience it.
you will
Yeah.
never know. Like you think you know what love is, and you kind of do, but you don't.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. It's a different expression of it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And to go back to the thing you said earlier about having the meltdown in the middle of Walmart and that kind of stuff, that they have to go through that. They have to experience that emotion in order to learn how to regulate it. They have to experience that sort of behavior to understand what it is, to be able to regulate it. And I'm fond of saying I am not at all interested in raising a well-behaved child. I'm interested in raising a well-adjusted adult. And so there's a certain amount of chaos that has to happen in order to be able to do that.
Well, what if they have to do that so you can learn how to not take life so seriously and get over it yourself and learn how to react to the situation too?
Exactly, right?
It's amazing the instantaneous beads of sweat my children have put on my forehead in the middle
Mm-hmm.
of public situations
Sure,
where I
sure.
was wrestling with my response.
Yeah. And then when people say stuff like, are you really going to let your kid do that? I'm like, let them? What do you mean let them? He's a person. I don't control him. I guide him. I advise him. I teach him. I do the best I can to set an example for him. But letting him, I can't. None of us can let another person do anything on their own. I mean, we can let people treat us a certain way, or we can let them leave our lives, right? But as far as controlling your child, letting him do that, you can corral them, you can keep them safe, but nobody lets any child do anything.
No.
Especially when they're doing something like that,
Every day's a lesson in that.
Truly.
I've got a 20-year-old and a 19-year-old, and I want so bad to do course corrections for them, but I can't.
Yep.
And they need to learn,
Yep.
But man, David, this has been awesome. The Advancing Man Project. I'll put the notes in the show, or I'll put the link in the notes of the show for people that want to check that out. One last question before you go.
Mm-hmm.
Do you like peanut butter?
I do indeed.
Creamy or crunchy?
Creamy all the way for me.
All right. Favorite brand?
Don't really have a favorite brand. I would say that if I was going to choose a favorite type, it would be the kind that you go in, the natural kind that like you can go in and grind it yourself, or that it's, where the oil cells at the top. I prefer that to the stuff that's more processed. I think I just developed a taste for that, but I have a hard time imagining myself ever saying no to any peanut butter. I mean, I'll eat crunchy,
Okay. Yeah, I won't turn it down.
No, I won't turn it down. I had a friend once who creamy was too creamy and crunchy was too crunchy, so she would mix the two together to get that. Yeah. So it was like half crunchy or half as crunchy as regular crunchy. And I'm like, good for you. I don't have the time or the energy to commit to something like that, but you figured that out, and good for you.
And yeah, no, she was particular, and she solved her
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah.
Awesome. Dave, this has been great. Thanks so much for being on the show, man.
Thank you for having me.
Hey guys, dads, if you are interested in David the Iron Tamer's Advancing Man project, you can check it out at advancingmanproject.com. He's got a small workshop coming up on May 17th that you can sign up for. Again, that's advancingmanproject.com. Thanks for listening. Now get outside and play.